Thanks so much, Tanya and Andre and Justina, for giving me a chance to be here with you guys. This is my first time with the Amsterdam user group, but it's so fun to see such a big, vibrant community that you guys have assembled here. So it's an honor for me to have a chance to visit and join you. My fame may be a little bit exaggerated by time. If you find a small enough niche in the world, you can be famous within it. So I live in this niche of the world called DevOps for Salesforce. And I did write a book called Mastering Salesforce DevOps, which I suspect is right here, over here. It is basically just as thick as this picture is in reality. It's a big old book. But it's a good reference book. It's basically the first book that talks about every aspect of the development lifecycle. And I work for a company called Copado, and Copado helps to basically provide an admin-friendly way of managing the development lifecycle. I'm a director, actually in the product marketing department, but my background is as a developer and Salesforce architect. I'm going to get into the slides, but I want to just make sure that I level set and make sure that you guys understand exactly what I'm talking about. What is DevOps? It'd be a bit of a shame to get through the presentation without having clarified what on earth this is that we're talking about, DevOps for Salesforce. But to help with that, well, here's the agenda, first of all. 2 new modules on Salesforce DevOps on Trailhead that I'll show you in a sec. Why do we need DevOps? How we can learn better ways of working, and then how to get started with DevOps. So I'm really, being a published author of a book is a treat, but the number of people who are going to manage to make their way through this big old book is perhaps limited. But for those of you who maybe don't have 60 hours to go through the whole book, if you've got 2 hours, you can go through these 2 badges that are now on Trailhead. So if you just go to Trailhead and search for either DevOps or Copado, you'll see both of these badges. And they're really, really nice. The Trailhead editors are fantastic. I wrote the original source material, and then they deleted half of the words that I put in there. So that it's basically as condensed as it can possibly be. They had your time in mind when they published these badges. So basically, if you want to go from 0 to Salesforce DevOps Master in 2 hours, get these 2 badges. There's a lot in there. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about why do we need DevOps. Trust me, I will explain what the heck DevOps is very soon, so you understand what that is. I would argue that these are some of the fun bits in building on Salesforce. Salesforce has all these nice, friendly, click-based builders. This is Schema Builder, which is kind of a fast and easy way to build your database model. This is everybody's favorite, Flow Builder, which, is a little bit complicated, but it's visual, right? So it makes it so easy to see and to pass along to your colleagues. You can design something, pass it along to your colleagues. I got into the Salesforce space because, it was pretty fun to work on, pretty easy to build. And I was in the nonprofit world for a long time, and they give free licenses to nonprofits. So lots of reasons to like Salesforce or love Salesforce. And all of those little builders, they're a bit like playing with Legos. You create all these different components, and it's very, it's nice to see on the list of attendees today, all the people with 0 to 1 year of experience in the Salesforce community. Because if I think about working in IT, what's the biggest bottleneck to, building an IT team or spinning up a project and so forth? It's finding people, right? Finding people with a computer science degree who are not asking for ridiculously large amounts of money and have, are not already, in some other busy job. So it's so hard to find people, and it's partly hard to find people because the tools are a little bit cryptic, writing code and so it's hard to get started. But Salesforce really makes it very accessible, such a big, wide open community, and so inclusive and encouraging as we can see from the user group. So here's the dream, right? You take all your little Salesforce Lego pieces and you can build, like they've built Salesforce Tower with Legos here. You can build this amazing org that your entire company runs on with all of these different components. So all of the data your company needs to operate, all the processes and so forth. But the trick is that in practice, when we're building on Salesforce, often we're building a tower that looks a lot more like this. So this is our Salesforce org, where if you get enough people involved, building for long enough time, it starts to go way beyond just simple Legos. You get into some kind of complicated stuff. And this is Jenga. I'm guessing you're probably familiar with the game. The classic characteristic of Jenga is that making changes is risky. That's the deal with the Jenga tower. Making changes is risky. Making changes always carries some risk. So I'm going to skip ahead to this slide and I'll go back to the one before just so we all know what I'm talking about. On this is a graph, but I'm in the marketing department, so this is the way we build graphs in the marketing department. Lots of pictures and big arrows. There's two axes on this graph, right? Safe and fast. Now, whose job requires that they be fast and also be safe and not break things? Probably everybody, right? So Facebook used to have this motto, move fast and break things. That was what they encouraged their engineers, be a bit bold and so forth. But I'm sure the motto in your company is move fast and don't break things, please. So we want to be both fast and safe. And so if you think, why on earth did your company's probably paying a bunch of money for Salesforce. Why are they paying money for Salesforce? Because they don't want to build from scratch, just using custom code-based applications. And so probably your company wanted to move to Salesforce for one of two reasons. Either to make it faster to build stuff by getting the subject matter experts and click-based admins and so forth coming in here and using these pre-built apps and these nice declarative interfaces and so forth and build things really fast. And certainly you can build things right in production in Salesforce and make that very fast. Or maybe your company was interested in building on Salesforce to make it safer, right? If you're building on a classic code-based app, one character in the wrong place can take down the entire application, right? Now you go to the web page and the whole whatever the site or the application is, it just doesn't work at all because of one character being out of place. It's really, really, really hard to break Salesforce. I know people who've done it, but in general, it's very hard to break Salesforce, very stable platform. But thinking about how we build on Salesforce, there's two ways to build on Salesforce. You can build directly live in production, which is fast, but not so safe, right? If you're making critical changes in production, not very safe. So any organization of any size moves their development process into sandboxes. You spin up a development sandbox, a testing sandbox, and a production sandbox. So you can experiment safely and test. You can validate your experiments in you experiment safely in the development environment. You can validate those changes in a testing environment. You can move it over to production when you're confident. But the problem is this is safe, but not so fast. So the idea with DevOps is if you want to be both fast and safe, you need some way of managing the flow of changes between these different environments that is better than change sets. So if you're in a pretty small team, just maybe a couple people, no huge time pressure and so forth, change sets are okay. Change sets are 13 years old now. Speaking of ideas on the App Exchange that Salesforce sometimes doesn't quite deliver on and that you might not want to hold your breath waiting for, the two most requested features on the Idea Exchange, or two of the top requested features, each with, I think, 80,000 votes, points behind them, are about improving the change set user interface because it's pretty horrendous. So think about what you do when you're building on Salesforce. What are you doing? You are helping make other people's jobs easier, right? That's your job, right? You automate systems, you build databases, you make processes. You're making somebody else's job easier. So, but if you're building on Salesforce and you've got this complex org and so forth, who's making your job easier? That's my question. So What are the pain points that you have in your job? What are the inefficiencies that you have in your job? And moving changes between these different environments is a big challenge. And let me go through this list of other challenges that you may face. Now, if you're in your first 0 to 1 years in the Salesforce ecosystem, I'm not trying to dim any of the glow or the excitement or the enthusiasm about building on Salesforce. But if you've been around Salesforce for more than 1 year, you're probably starting to get some feeling for some of the pain points that happen when you've got a big team and a lot going on. So I like to start with this one, the first pain point, that everybody has only a partial view of the situation. There was a comment that Paul made at the very beginning of the session. Salesforce comes out with all these new releases, and he confessed to not reading every bit of the release notes. Who reads every bit of the release notes? How much stuff is coming out from Salesforce? How much stuff is in your org? All of us have a partial view, right? It's just, that's reality. That's the way the world works. In your organization, there's no person, unless you have a very small org, there's no person who knows the entire org. There's no person who knows the entire business, unless you're a sole proprietorship. So there's too much going on for anybody to know everything that's going on. And that gets complicated because, especially this is true for consultants, right? If you've been building on Salesforce for a while, you may not know why every component is there. And consultants have to come into somebody else's org, and they have to look at what's there, and they have to make sense of it and make it better, but they have no idea where it came from. You don't know the history of the orgs. So with the exception of flows, where it stores the previous states, basically anything can change in a Salesforce org, and you'll never really know where it came from. And it is like living life with no memory, where you don't remember where you came from. So sandboxes get out of sync. As soon as you've got sandboxes, they start getting out of sync. Deployments are difficult. Changes cause unexpected effects. And users do things that we didn't predict, and the business wants us to move faster. So anybody, I don't know if you guys want to mention in the chat, are any of these pain points or challenges resonating with folks on the chat? Feel free to pile on if any of these things.
People are agreeing with you, and then we have also that the 700 pages for release notes are not a lovely book to read.
That's right. That's right. There's a lot, right? And Kara was mentioning about managing different development streams, right? So if you get to the point where it's more than 5 or more than 10 people working on Salesforce, you've got to figure out how to break it into teams, manage those different development streams. There's a lot going on, right? This is your job. I'm going to ask that question again. Who's helping you automate your job, right? Building on Salesforce. Ironically, it's a little bit meta, right? But ironically, you need somebody to help automate your job. So this is, this shows my roots doing architecture. This slide is normally banned in the marketing department because of too many different lines and boxes and so forth. But you've got 2 options, right? No process where you build everything in production, or a slow process where you're building things in development and you have to move to test and production. Why do people not want to build in production? Or why do people get asked to please stop building things in production? Because there's a high risk of failures. Where there's a high risk of failures, you get, I call it dissatisfaction, but basically this means people yelling at you. There are people yelling at you. Nobody wants people yelling at you. So you end up stopping building in production, you move to this process. But what happens if it's hard, what happens when you're working with sandboxes, it's often very hard to deploy. It's hard to deploy metadata. And if you have to deal with data, and I'm talking about like Salesforce CPQ or Velocity or Encino or Basic Gov or any of these big managed packages that deal with a lot of data, and you've got to move that between development testing environments, that's really hard to do. So what happens when something is hard to do? And I'm thinking now again about all of the list of things we should do on Rob's wall, eat more healthy, exercise more. And well, if any of those things don't come naturally to us, then what do? We, delay, we defer it, we push it off, right? Be happy is on his wall. I just saw that as well. So we want to be happy, right? And it conflicts, right? Being happy and exercising a lot, or being happy and doing deployment sometimes may conflict for us. So we push things off and we do infrequent deployments. We deploy as infrequently as we possibly can. What does that mean? If you're deploying once per week or once every 2 weeks, or every month, or every quarter, something like that, you got big deployments. When you have big deployments, you're deploying like dozens or hundreds of metadata components at one time. Again, you've got a high risk of failures, or you've got to spend a whole weekend coordinating with a team, got to have these really complex test cycles. And all of this delay means you're not really getting feedback. The beauty, Dennis was raving about the power of using, lightning email templates. Why? Because there's this instant feedback loop. You drag something and you see what it looks like. And so what that is instant feedback. So for human beings, it looks like there's a lot of humans on this call. For human beings, we really thrive with instant feedback. Make a change, see what happens, make it better. Make a change, see what happens, make it better. This iterative loop. When you're developing in Sandboxes, it's hard to get that kind of iterative loop. You need to get things out to your users, see what they think of them, get the feedback, make it better. And so there's a feedback cycle. Even when you're working in Sandboxes, you want to make this as tight as you can, moving towards as close as you can to real-time feedback. So does it really matter whether you have tools that make you efficient at your job building on Salesforce? Let's say you're laboring in the dungeons of the Salesforce admin, admin shop, wherever you're working, you're sort of somewhere down, far separated from all the customers and far separated from the executives and so forth. Does it really matter, if you have good tools and are efficient in your process? Heck, yes, it does matter. So think about your company, all of the customers that your company is interacting with, they're either big companies or individual consumers. And every one of those customers is interacting with other people in your company, like customer support agents or sales people, or somebody like that. And all of those people are working on your Salesforce app. Let's say you've got a Service Cloud app that you've built and so forth. On average, when we've looked at teams, there's about 300 users per Salesforce developer or admin. That's the ratio that I've seen on average. 300 users in your company, 300 employees in your company, depending on each admin or developer. And they're all relying upon this app. And then you've got to build this app. How fast, how quickly can you make changes? If you need to make a change to the app, how long does it take you to roll that out to your users? They need something desperately. How well can you roll it out? How well can you support them? That's this little arrow here. Because you're building on Salesforce, you have an exponential impact on your organization. And if you can make a 10% improvement, just even that, 5, 10, 20% improvement in your ability to make changes to Salesforce at scale and deliver things to production, that helps all of your employees that are using Salesforce, and that helps them help all their customers. And so you are having an exponential impact, which is why there really is, why you should take pride in your job, and why you need good tools to do your job, and you need to think about this stuff. Okay. So DevOps is all about giving you tools and processes and so forth that help you to do your job. So the term DevOps came about in 2009 with a talk that was given at an IT conference from Flickr. If you remember this image sharing company, I think they're still around. Flickr, Dev and Ops cooperating together. They were doing 10 deploys per day, which at that time was kind of unheard of. So then this became a movement over the last 10 years, and everybody in Salesforce is familiar with Agile, right? Almost everybody, sprints and scrums and stories and all this kinds of stuff. But DevOps is a little bit younger than Agile, about 10 years old as opposed to 20-ish years old. So it's not as universally well known yet, but there's been a ton written about it in the broader IT world, the DevOps handbook, the State of DevOps survey that's been running. And I believe, I'm incredibly biased, of course, because I'm kind of focused very much on this space, but I believe the best thinking that's happening in IT and computer science and so forth, a lot of it about how people work together, how teams collaborate, is happening in the DevOps community. So the conferences, the caliber of discussion is very, very high. It's dealing with things like leadership. It's dealing with things like organizational change, people's psychological capacity, what we do, how we collaborate as a team, sense of psychological safety on teams. Yeah, all right. So what is DevOps? Just memorize this slide. It's just these three things. This is your simple version of what is DevOps. These three things: flow, feedback, and continuous learning and improvement. Imagine you've got your developers over here on the left, your end users over here on the right. And this is basically systems that are in operation. And that's what it means. Ops means systems that are being operated, or running in production. And whoops, sorry. And there's three movements. One is the flow of changes from left to right, being able to deliver valuable changes from the developers through testing environments over to the users. And that's the first sort of capability within DevOps, being able to move things across more quickly. I saw in the chat, Ingrid was saying, I have seen too many changes. It sounds like, somebody with some PTSD, right? Some memories of war. So change sets are ugly, and they're really ugly at scale. So they're a pretty poor way to manage this flow. They're not optimized for high velocity of changes. But that's often what people emphasize when they talk about DevOps. Oh, they're talking about, automating deployments. But really, that's just the first part of the story. The second part is feedback. Listen and monitor. And this is what I mentioned about that real-time feedback, how humans do so well. If you can do something, see what happens. Think about when you're a little kid and you're learning, right? You take these blocks and you try to shove them in holes. And this real-time feedback. Is it working? Is it not working? We need that still, that feedback. So that's feedback from users, but it's also feedback monitoring our own processes, getting metrics on our processes. How many deployments are we able to do per week, per year? But then through that, learning and improving the process. So DevOps is not almost everything that you see in most user groups, almost everything you see on Trailhead, almost everything you see in the conferences and so forth is all about what you build, what you're building. DevOps is all about how you're building, the way that you work together as a team. The way that you're building as a team is as important, perhaps more important than what you're building, and improving your ability as a team to build and to improve the system is what DevOps is all about. So I mentioned monitoring and metrics. This is some slides from within the Copado product about getting metrics on the development lifecycle itself. And just like, your sales team, Salesforce was built, right, to help ease the process of managing the sales lifecycle. And everybody knows how important sales process metrics are for the sales team, that you can change your approach based on the metrics that you're observing. Increasingly, we're recognizing the importance of looking at metrics on the development lifecycle itself. And these four metrics on the left are particularly important. How frequently are you deploying? The lead time, from the time that you've built something, how long does it take until that's running in production? It can take a long time to build something, but once you've built it, all the hard work is done. Then how long until that's running in production? That's your lead time. And then your change fail rate. When you roll something out to production, how often does something break? And then the recovery time. So when something breaks, at that point, the only metric that anybody cares about is how fast can you fix it. And so that's what recovery time is and why it's so important. And over here on the right, this is another thing that's in Copado. It's called a value stream map. And this is something that is very interesting to think about. There are these roles within a team, a role for planning, a role for development. Often, maybe there's an integration role, but often at least there's a testing role, a release management role, and then getting metrics on how long it takes to move a piece of work through these different stages. And so what you have with these metrics is you get feedback and some input into whether the team can improve in different ways or not. Any questions so far on anything that I've shared? Welcome to put it in the chat or go off mute as you prefer. But we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. Thanks, Brecht. Okay. All right. So I wanted to, it would be a shame if we got through this presentation and you didn't get some explanation about topics like version control, because if you're, this may not be, Salesforce is an interesting environment, right? Because there's so many people involved in Salesforce who do not have computer science degrees, right? Who have not worked in traditional application development. And so they've not perhaps come across things like version control very much, but more and more and more every year at these conferences, back in the days when we used to have conferences, there'd be sessions on, version control and continuous integration, these kinds of things. What's that about? So I mentioned that challenge at the beginning where we don't have a history of why a change was made in an org or why something's there. You look at a workflow rule. Who put that in your org? When? Why? Salesforce will generally tell you who was the last person to modify something, who was the first person to modify something, when, and so forth. And that's useful. But there's nothing in Salesforce that tells you why, unless you fill in the description field. Hint, hint, you should fill in the description field. But there's a lot of unanswered questions, right? And have things changed over time? How much have they changed? There's a lot of information that you probably, if you're anything like, I was a developer, right? I spent a lot of my time just doing detective work. Like, what is this? What does it do? Why is it here? Why is it written this way? And it's information, right? Giving information. So version control does a lot of things. And I divided it into this twofold breakdown: defensive version control and offensive version control. Defensive version control is just the simplest, easiest way to get started. You can use a tool like Copado, for example, to take a snapshot of all the metadata in each of your orgs every day, say. And then you can at least see how things are evolving and changing. And if you do end up having to do some detective work, like, how did this thing get here? Like, when did that change? Why is it there? That can help. But offensive version control really means that you're intentionally tracking things. And if you've never worked with version control before, the way it works is you make some changes. And then after a certain point, you basically say, okay, these are the changes I made, and this is why I made it. And it records who did it, when you did it, what you did, and why you did it. Those are reasonable questions. Who, what, when, why. And it basically creates a trail. It's a little bit like the setup audit trail, in Salesforce, except it doesn't suck. The setup audit trail is just horrific, right? Just try to go through that and try to make sense of what's going on. But version control provides a much more sensible way of looking at it. Now the trick is, Git is the most common kind of version control. Most people have heard of GitHub and these kinds of things. Git is normally operated from the command line, typing commands in the command line, and there's some graphical user interfaces and so forth. But that's not so helpful for admins, right? And in Salesforce, the admins are developers too, right? Admins are the click-based folks, are the ones who are doing a lot of the work, right? So that's why it's very helpful to have a tool like Copado. This is not meant to be commercial. And to be fair, there are a number of tools for Salesforce that help provide a user interface to track things in Git. But it's really important to think about the admins. and how to include them in the process. Now, why did discussions about DevOps and automating deployments and so forth typically start with version control? Because not only does version control give you a history, it gives you a way to attach automated tools and other kinds of automation to your process to run tests and run deployments and so forth. So there's this common term that's thrown around a lot, continuous integration or CI. So you might have heard of CI or CI tools or continuous integration. It's a little bit confusing because continuous integration itself is a process. Now, it's helpful to have a tool to help with that process, but continuous integration itself is a process. Continuous integration, so I don't know, in this group, if you just have one development sandbox where all the developers are, so if you don't have any sandboxes in production, everything's just already integrated, right? So continuous integration is not something you need because it's already integrated. And if you only have one development sandbox, continuous integration is also not something you need because everything's integrated. You make a change in that development sandbox and everybody gets the change. But often if your teams get big enough, you need multiple development sandboxes. And as soon as you get multiple development sandboxes and environments, you need a way to make sure that you're working on the latest version and that, if Paul's making changes over in his sandbox, that I'm getting his changes relatively quickly and he's getting my changes relatively quickly, so that we're kind of building on the same thing and not just building in complete isolation from one another. So it means having a way to merge the work of all of the developers and all of the team into a common code base, at least daily. And that's what continuous means. Continuous means more frequently than you think. The alternative, I don't know if has anybody ever been in a big project where they have like a big Sales Cloud implementation, then that runs for like 3 months, 6 months, and they have a big Service Cloud implementation that runs for 3 months and 6 months, and then you try to merge them at the end, right? Yeah, that's right, Andre. Andre's facial expression shows it all, right? It's like, I don't know it's just so not cool. It just so doesn't work. It's like, baking 2 dishes, right? And then trying to merge those dishes at the end, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to take my casserole and I'm going to take your pie and we're going to like squish them together at the end. And there's a lot of inefficiency and a lot of rework and a lot of pain involved in that. So you want to integrate the team's work as often as you can. So this is a picture, a graphical depiction of what this looks like with multiple sandboxes moving into, typically you're looking at one integration environment in Salesforce to integrate the work of the sandboxes, and continuous integration means merging those changes quickly. So continuous integration leads into the need for automated testing. Because if you're really moving changes between these groups regularly, you need a way to tell if something has broken. So the automated tests that is most common in the Salesforce world are Apex unit tests. And I saw there's mostly admins on this group, so maybe you've not had to work much with Apex unit tests. But if you're a developer, you're familiar with Apex unit tests. Salesforce people, I think usually they're just really lazy about these unit tests. They just write only what they have to get 75% code coverage to be able to deploy to production. Salesforce was trying to force people into a good habit of writing tests by giving the 75% code coverage requirement to deploy code to production. But in practice, we've taken a really lazy approach. There's not a strong testing culture in Salesforce, but Salesforce unit tests are meant to help with continuous integration. They're meant to basically say, let's say you spend 2 or 3 days writing a piece of code, and then you want to make sure nobody ever breaks that work, right? Because that's such a waste if you spend 2 or 3 days writing something and then somebody just can break it whenever they want. That's a horrible waste, right? So if you've written that code, then you can write unit tests to confirm that your code is still working the way it's supposed to work and that nobody's broken it. And then what happens is when people merge their code together, you run the unit tests, and if they break your code, they're not allowed to move forward with those changes. That's what unit tests are for, right? They're to protect all of your hard work instead of causing people to waste their effort. So unit tests are really precious, but we need to put more energy in. So when we look at testing, though, this is the way I think about it. This is what the business requested, but this is what you've built. So there's all these capabilities sort of beneath the surface. And so quality and testing have many levels. And so when you look at quality in terms of functional quality, you're asking the question, does it do what it's supposed to do? And so functional quality, when you have people doing manual tests, that's normally what they're doing. They're checking functional quality. And your user acceptance tests, that's functional quality. But there's all of these other interesting things or challenging things beneath the surface. Reliability, does it break easily? Security, performance, maintainability, size, all of these things are very important considerations. And so there's different kinds of tests and different kinds of, like performance tests and security checks and so forth. So your unit tests are meant to help enforce quality and ensure that that's maintained over time. Yeah, and it's just an important part of the process. So I'm getting towards the end of the slides, and how am I doing on time? Am I running over? Am I killing everybody? Okay. Yeses,
You're
nos.
good. You're good.
Yeah,
Okay.
all good. About 8 minutes left.
All right, 8 minutes. Okay. I mentioned at the very beginning this whole thing about sandboxes getting out of sync. How many people here are even working with sandboxes? Is that the majority of folks? Yeah, that's nice. That's that thumb thing. That's clever. Okay. So as soon as you've got a sandbox that's been cloned from production, the moment you give somebody admin access to that sandbox and somebody else has admin access to production, they start to become more different from one another. And the longer those sandboxes exist with people having admin access to them, the more different they become from one another. Now, that's not because somebody's doing something wrong. That's just how the universe operates. The second law of thermodynamics, which governs all systems in the universe, is that the entropy in a system always increases. It never decreases. Things always become more different from one another. They never become more similar unless you work to make them more similar. If you have two identical twins, they're born, they naturally become more different the longer they live. They never become more similar, right? So, well, that's not the normal flow unless there's effort put in. But that's the same thing that's happening with your sandboxes. Now, what is that? Who cares? Why does it matter? Well, it's because the whole point of having sandboxes is to have a development environment that looks a lot like your production environment. And if people are just making changes in production and they're not sending those back to your development environment, well, hey, you're developing off in your own world and it's unrelated to what everybody else is doing. Like this old expression about leadership. If you may think you're leading, but if nobody's following you, you're just taking a walk. So if you're developing over here independent of what's going on in production, then it's, you're wasting so much time. There's so much wasted time and effort in the whole development process. That's the horrendous thing. And then maybe you move it over to the testing environment, but the testing environment is just subtly different from your development environment because everybody's logging in and doing things manually. And, oh yeah, I forgot to move this back here and I had to make this change. And, oh, they really needed this in a hurry. And so you move it into your testing environment and it works in development, but it doesn't work in testing, or it works in testing and you move it to production and it doesn't work in production. We cause new errors. And like, who on earth has time for all of that nonsense? Seriously? Like how much of people's lives are we wasting because we can't get control over these environments? Now, if you're only in a small project, small team, maybe these are not concerns that are on your mind, but as soon as things scale up, this is going to be on your mind. So how do we control that? Through this practice known as continuous delivery. So I showed this diagram of these environments. Continuous delivery deals with these environments sort of over to the right and the whole life cycle, whereas continuous integration is about mixing the work between developers and the integration environments. Continuous delivery is about helping to ensure that we have control over these upstream environments. My very favorite story about the importance of gaining control over these environments, I included in the book in the very last chapter. I wrote a section of the book called Locking Everyone Out. Locking everybody out of production. And it's about Salesforce. I don't know if there's a company called Salesforce.com. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of it, but they had this deal where they have the world's biggest Salesforce org called Org 62. It's been running the longest. It's the biggest, most complicated. And hey, guess what? They don't really have governor limits. They're able to cheat on all this stuff. So they built all of this, it's the most ugly, messy, horrendous of all of the Salesforce orgs in the world is Salesforce's own org. Now, Salesforce has been telling people from the very beginning how easy it is to build on Salesforce. And so everybody thought, I should be able to build an Org 62 too. Let me in, let me in. So they had hundreds of people who had admin access to Org 62. And they're just off building whatever they want in production and so forth. And for years, right, from the early 2010s and so forth, there were teams within Salesforce that said, no, we have to get these admins out of Org 62. Nobody can make changes directly. Everything's got to go through this development lifecycle. We've got to automate this process. And then they're like, oh, but it's Salesforce. You should be able to just click and make changes. Come on, why are you so mean, And then somebody, in a moment of frustration, after having spent a weekend trying to recover from some horrendous disaster in Org 62, said, okay, let's figure out the financial impact of having downtime. Okay, so the two of us have to work through the weekend, so that's X dollars. And then we had to get the VP of engineering on this call for 5 hours over the weekend, so that's X dollars. And then we had this amount of lost productivity. So they basically said, this is how much a single downtime incident is costing us. This is the cost of having people make changes directly in production. And they showed that to the executives and they're like, oh, like, I didn't understand the financial implications of people not following a development lifecycle. Okay, now I get it, right? For people who think mostly in dollar signs, that helped to make a convincing argument that in fact you need to have a pipeline, which you could call this a development pipeline, to manage things. All right, and this is a picture from Copado of the development pipeline that we have sort of built into the tool that allows you to see the environments, the status of the different deployments, and move different batches of changes like user stories through here. So basically that's it. All of this and more is in these 2 Trailhead badges that you can go check out. And I'm so happy to have had a chance to share with you, but we've got a few minutes, just a couple minutes for questions if anybody wants to come off mute and ask.
Yeah, hi guys. Myself is Srini. So I do have a not Salesforce experience. Sorry about that, but I'm very keen on Salesforce nowadays. I'm trying to get onto Salesforce, but I have a good amount of experience with the DevOps, data, blah blah stuff. But so do we have a similar process for like a typical data world or app world? We do have a Git, a Docker, Jenkins, all this for continuous integration and continuous deployment. We do have a similar process here as well in Salesforce, or it's only Git?
Good questions. It's a minority of most of the technologies like Docker that people talk about in the DevOps world don't translate and can't be used in Salesforce, but some of them can. So Git can be used in Salesforce. Jenkins and other CI tools are often used in Salesforce. But the thing is with Jenkins, you've got to write your own scripts to make it work. And that takes a lot of time, investment, and they're not nearly as well developed. The open source tools for that are not nearly as well developed as they are for traditional application development. So that's why in Salesforce, you've got about 8 companies that are commercial companies that provide tools to help ease the release management process for Salesforce. Copado, who I work for, is one of them, but there's a number of others. And the reason these companies exist is because Salesforce works very differently in a lot of ways from some of the other applications. You can't just take your files and push them to Salesforce, a Salesforce server quite the same way. And so there's unique challenges. And so you have these commercial tools that help.
Yeah, I do understand that. And recently I read one article on even Kubernetes. So even Salesforce wanted to integrate their like a lot of process into Kubernetes. I was wondering how we can do that. So that's the main reason I wanted to join, but eventually I'll be into the Salesforce, I'm sure.
Okay. One thing, when you look at blogs, one thing you need to distinguish in your mind is, are they talking about building on Salesforce, or are they talking about building Salesforce? Because sometimes there are blogs from the Salesforce engineering team that talk about how Salesforce themselves is moving into Kubernetes on the back end and the engineering that Salesforce is doing to build their own product. But these user groups and most of the writing on Salesforce is about how to build on top of Salesforce. You cannot use Kubernetes in any way on top of Salesforce, even though Salesforce is moving their own architecture.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, pleasure to have an opportunity to ask you in person. One of the capabilities from the Accelerate book is to have a lightweight change approval process. They mentioned that a process based on peer review produces superior performance than using change approval boards. Could you somehow comment on that? How can we implement this in Salesforce when developers usually have a partial view of a system? And
so in terms of change approval, sometimes one traditional idea is you build something, somebody else has to look at it, but often people don't really look at it very carefully. They don't understand it. It just waits around for a long time. The fastest kind of change approval is pair programming, where you have your friend who's also on the team look at what you've done, you talk through it, maybe you're even sitting together through the whole development process. That basically it puts two brains and 2 pairs of eyes on the same work. Now that's a cultural thing within the company, whether they're willing to accept that, but basically it's what it does is it distributes the knowledge across the team. So both of you understand and both of you improve your view. They share their good practices. You guys share the good practices. You can think about more of the consequences. So that's one on one side of the spectrum. The other, so there's a bunch of ways to do it, but basically that point that's made in the Accelerate book is very powerful. That basically it's not bringing any real value to the organization to make things spend forever in some change approval process. So it'll depend on the structure of your team and what you're building, but you can take that as evidence to your boss and say, maybe there's a different way of approaching this that's more efficient and lower risk.
okay. Yeah, we're trying to implement this in our company, but sometimes the question is who knows what better. For example, if I'm a developer and I'm reviewing work of a fellow admin, I may miss something. And it depends on the knowledge, how senior someone, maybe there is someone who's more senior who can spot more things, but he doesn't work on this user story in particular, something like that. So we're trying to find a balance in that.
And so it may feel like, okay, well, there's no 2 people in your team who have time and perfect knowledge. So how do we avoid any risk of failures? Well, that's a real challenge. It's a real problem. But why would anybody think that the change advisory board or some other reviewer would have any better chance of spotting a problem than you and your fellow admin would? So typically what happens with a change advisory board is they get a whole bunch of things at one time, and they just scan through them, and they're like, looks okay. There's this joke that says if you submit 5 lines of code for review, you're going to get 5 issues. If you submit 500 lines of code, they're going to say, looks okay to me, right? And so what you want to be doing is increasing the knowledge flow within the team. So your admin friend can inform you, don't do this, Vladimir, because that's a little bit risky. And then and so you're improving your knowledge through that process of working with your colleague. And so it performs many functions. That peer review performs many functions, especially sharing the knowledge and building that knowledge together. And not pretending that there's some imaginary, all-knowing architect who has infinite time to investigate all of the possibilities and review things. So, worst case, you guys screw something up, and then you're definitely going to learn not to do that again, right? So, but that's important. That's part of the way we learn.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vladimir.
I'm not sure if sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure if there's more questions, but I'd say if we can move them to the end.
And I'm happy to respond to things on chat. So I'll go back and look at the chat and type things in while Ty is presenting as well. So feel free to ask questions then.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, also did learn quite a bit about CI/CD. It's the first time I actually see it presented like in a way I understand it. I was pretending to know what CI/CD is, but now I can actually say I do.
We're all pretending, and seriously, that's great. I'm delighted. Thank you.
Thank you.